Hello, my name is Bryce Bicknell, and this is the Beyond Phenomenal podcast. This started as a project of mine to try and address a problem within the UFO or UAP field that I think stems from the way that the information is organized. I know that a lot of people probably who are into this field and people who aren't are kind of put off by how network-based it is and how loosely tied together these narratives are. It seems like most people have this general idea of, well, I know the government knows more, and they probably have something. Maybe they've heard about Roswell, or you might know about that, and that they might have had something crash. But it's just kind of an idea, and it just fills up a background of your kind of context to what's maybe going on in the world, and you don't think about it that much. But for me, when I had those kind of thoughts, I saw something interesting and I was like, hey, let's find out about this. And slowly, I think what tends to happen, and I want to do with this podcast, is bring together the pieces of the puzzle that ultimately give you an incredible view of what our reality might look like. I think about all of the one-off pieces of evidence that we hear about Roswell. Maybe we see the Calvine UFO photo. Maybe we've seen those Navy pilot videos, and we're like, well, those are crazy. It's interesting. What exactly is going on here? But we don't have the context or the history or even the full picture with this kind of stuff to really make a sense of it all. I know for me personally, when I see photos, my natural reaction is kind of like, well, okay, that's cool. We all want something definitive. And I think part of this is to give that definitive nature of where things are in relation to maybe what the government knows, maybe what people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, because there's some really interesting things that people just kind of keep to themselves because of stigma or whatever reason. And I want to bring together these different narratives that seem to be disparate and make it approachable to people. And so I want to keep it brief with everyone. I know not everyone has a lot of time to go through these 2-hour-long interviews with people who are talking about technical things and how does it even relate to what you want to know. I think what the average person wants to know is, are we alone? And where are we? Do we know? Are there people in the world who know more than we do? Do they have craft? Are there bodies? Is there an interdimensional component? How does this relate with spirituality or religion? Any of these kind of questions that come up, these are the questions people care about. And so hopefully this will be a useful tool to everyone, and I'm open to feedback. And I can just get into the overall structure of how I want to do this podcast. I'm thinking of kind of weekly or bi-weekly news as it comes up. I'll talk about stuff I think that's relevant and try and connect all the good stuff and leave out the more watery hype stuff that comes up and just focus on, hey, this happened, this is something interesting, this is relevant. And then we can move on to maybe some big picture stuff, and I'll talk about what I think. I'd love to maybe hear what other people have to think, get some discussions going. I want to engage everyone because I think this is a really interesting topic, and I think it's a shame that it gets kind of a bad name because of maybe the public, the PR, and whatever stigma has been created into our culture over time. So without any further ado, I'll just get right into the weekly news. The current interesting thing that's been going on is the Mosul orb photo that was released by Jeremy Corbell. This is a tangible piece of evidence that was taken, I believe, from our military. It shows a classic shiny orb sphere looking thing over Mosul in some location. I believe someone pinpointed it on Reddit, if you want to see. And I apologize, to give proper context to a lot of these news stories, there are going to be a lot of names. So Jeremy Corbell is an investigative documentarian who's released some films, interesting stuff about Skinwalker Ranch, I believe something called Patient 17. Other people, I think John Lear he's interviewed. Once again, I apologize. You got to keep these things straight, and I'll do my best to help you with that. Jeremy Corbell makes documentaries, works on the UFO field, and he's sort of the protege of George Knapp. George Knapp was known as just a normal investigative reporter for the Las Vegas KLOS TV station. In, I think, 1989, though, this all changed when he interviewed Bob Lazar. Bob Lazar is a famous guy who said, we're reverse engineering alien flying saucers at Area 51. He's the reason why, well, he didn't say Area 51, he said S4, but he's the reason why Area 51 has its name today. So I'll put it back all together for you. Bob Lazar, Area 51, he gets interviewed by George Knapp. And George Knapp has done a ton of things, and we can talk about that later. But George Knapp works with Jeremy Corbell. And so recently, Jeremy Corbell dropped this photo, and they have a new podcast called Weaponized that they said they're going to be releasing more information. So this is a pretty interesting thing. Their names are important in this whole discussion because George Knapp, especially because he goes back a lot further, he's done a lot of behind-the-scenes work for the UAP field. But this orb, check it out. You can find it on Jeremy's Twitter account. You can find it all across his social media. His last name is spelled Corbell. And this isn't the first time we've heard reports of orbs. We're going to kind of talk about a few different shapes of UAP and how they kind of come up in this week's episode. But I want to connect it to another case because you should just go look at the photo. This is another instance where you can look at another sphere hands-on. This one's hands-on because it's been kind of crashed. I don't exactly know all of the context, but I believe it was found in a field somewhere. This is the Betz sphere, B-E-T-Z, the Betz sphere, and it was highlighted in Ross Coulthart and Bryce Zabel's 7 News Spotlight special. Once again, more names. I'll give you some context. Bryce Zabel, known in California for producing a TV show called Dark Skies. This is another back in the day when they'd call it UFO kind of fictional narrative about the government knows and what should we do, and it's dramatized. I haven't seen it personally, but I've heard good things. Ross Coulthart wrote a fantastic book called In Plain Sight. It was one of my first introductions into the field of ufology, and I thought it had a lot of relevant information and it was high impact, so I really recommend if you're going to read any book, read that one. And I'll link the 7 News special in the description here, but they look at this orb hands-on. They take some photos of it. There's some interesting, they have it rolled on a hill, some funny weird stuff like that where it's a little cheesy that the producers just wanted to do. But the real gold behind it is, okay, we've seen this photo posted by Jeremy Corbell. Now there's this other scientist, Dr. Gary Nolan, who's a famous Stanford professor, world-class scientist. He is going to analyze this sphere that they have that seems to be of the same kind of characteristics as this Mosul orb. And he's going to use very advanced laboratory equipment, but this takes a ton of time and money. So according to his most recent interviews, I believe it'll take several months for this all to shake out. But that's an interesting thing with orbs. It's an interesting, I guess, dynamic that we see saucers. I'll talk about Tic Tacs in the kind of next segment. But when, and then we also see just orbs and spheres and balls of light, all kinds of strange things that all seem to be connected. Now, the story I want to get into is tangential to the Tic Tac incident, but it relates to another kind of the shape of the object, and there seems to be some like categorical similarities in the same way that those orbs were connected that I was talking about. There are these Tic Tac connections, I guess. And so Ryan Graves was another pilot who came forward, who saw UAP. And so one of his contacts, he posted in a Medium article, which I'll also link, from some guy who was in the Navy, and his name was John Baughman, Baughman. And I'll just read the quote from what he said that compares, he talks about this Tic Tac he saw. I believe he was deployed in the Navy, and he would spend a lot of time looking in the water and got a good sense of, he would see all kinds of animals, orcas, or maybe orcas is too much, but he saw a lot of different animals that would help give him a sense of scale and things like that. So I'll get into the quote. So, I was staring into the water from above when a large, fat, white Tic Tac object, approximately 20 feet in length, suddenly appeared in my view below me, moving right and darted into the depths as fast as it appeared. I couldn't really comprehend what I saw. It was definitely a solid object, but when it descended, its forward end rapidly collapsed in on itself and disappeared. So, that's pretty crazy. What we'll talk about, I think, probably fairly consistently in this podcast are witness testimony. It's a lot of personal accounts. There is a frustrating lack of physical evidence, I would say, and photographic evidence that has a chain of custody that can be tied to like the government or something like that, because they're usually very tight-lipped. But this is nonetheless, it's very important to look at the witness testimony, because it's another part of the piece. It's another piece in the puzzle. And so I thought I would highlight that. And I'll bounce back for the next kind of news update. It also has to do with a Tic Tac encounter, but this one is back to the 2004 Nimitz case, where they saw the Tic Tac. So I know it can be hard to keep track of all of this stuff. It's going to be kind of an information overload, but just maybe perhaps take it in kind of like bite size of information. I'll also try and post my simple thread of talking points. It's not going to be super organized, but it'll just kind of, if you want to read it in this form, it'll probably save you some time too. But I'll just jump into it. His bio, his name is Patrick Hughes, who posted on Twitter. Former first-class avionics tech in the U.S. Navy, 2004 Tic Tac witness. E2 Hawkeyes are awesome. I can be a loudmouth and a smartass. Just thought I'd give a little bit of context, because context is everything, really. This was the thread. Quote, on November 14th, 2004, an E-2C Hawkeye with VAW-117 was airborne during the now famous intercept. Utilizing its new ESM system, the Hawkeye tracked and recorded a handful of electronic signals from the encountered objects, one of which briefly flew besides them. I thought that was pretty interesting. I hadn't heard that anecdote from the Nimitz case. And then he goes on to say, I've hinted as strongly as I can what those signals were, as the true answer is classified, but I can tell you they were not identified by the extensive database of signals the system had. But the raw data was significant enough that our bricks were taken. I'm assuming these are where they store the information for these sensor systems. Quote, briefly touched upon during their unplanned debrief after the flight, and while my bricks were being confiscated, was the fact that the reason we had maintenance tasking to record the flight was to get recorded data while alerting the smallest number of people. Likely why we were only tasked the night before to do so. So it seems like there's kind of an interesting, cloak and dagger aspect to what Patrick Hughes is saying. I thought this was another really interesting anecdote too, because it shows that we're not necessarily being told the whole story, or that we know the whole story from the 2004 Nimitz case, which is so pivotal to the overall UAP discussion that's elaborated today. And so let me move on to another thing too. Feel free to pause this as you want if you want to go back on stuff, but it is going to be kind of information dense, just because I'm trying to get it all done so that you can get on with your life and be like, okay, I know what's going on. But if you want me to slow it down too, feel free to reach out, and I'll be very receptive to feedback, because I know there's a reason why podcasts work the way that they do. Usually it's two people who interview and do a long chat kind of session, but I'll without further ado, I'll just get into the next point, which is discussing MUFON. I believe it's the Mutual UFO Network. That's their acronym. They have a role within the new, I really do apologize for all these acronyms, AARO, All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. This is the new office that was created through the 2023 Intelligence Authorization Act, which was rolled into the NDAA. So horrible amount of acronyms there. But basically what this means is the civilian MUFON, they take a bunch of these reports. They're talking about their new collaboration with the government UAP office. And I'll read the quote that came from their January newsletter, I believe is where it came from. And it's pretty interesting what they're saying. So, quote, one of the most exciting projects of the year is MUFON being recognized by the United States government as a leader in UFO/UAP investigations. In fact, it has been nominated to be the civilian component on the currently developing UAP panel. This nomination is totally bipartisan and has been introduced in both the House and Senate. It has over 100 signatures so far. Below is the copy of the letter of resolution. And so this leads into that letter. We are writing to request that you give full consideration to the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON. So they're writing this right now. to serve as a civilian component to the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office Task Force. For 53 years, MUFON has gathered and investigated reports of UAP worldwide, averaging 10,000 to 12,000 sightings per month. The organization uses scientists, photographers, and forensic experts to investigate each UAP and can prove that 92% of events are explainable. Over the past few decades, they have had various contractual relationships with the DoD to provide information to the ATIP program regarding sightings of interest. So I'm going to stop the quote right now to just give a little bit of context. I think this is an interesting admission in itself that I originally wasn't aware of. So the civilian effort by MUFON has been assisting the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, that's ATIP, which was reported in the New York Times article from 2017. You can find that under, I think it's, quote, black budget, black money, dark auras, and black budget programs. But it's a very famous article, and if you look up New York Times reporting, you'll be able to find it. This is the program that Lou Elizondo headed, much to some certain controversial backlash, but we can talk about that on another day. But it shows that MUFON was already having a relationship with ATIP, which shapes the dynamic in an important way, because historically, when you look at the role of civilian organizations like this, there have been, thanks to some of the reading I've done of Richard Dolan's, there have been some interesting connections between the government and these civilian efforts. There's some overlap of people who leave and then they work there. Some have been in the Air Force, some have been in intelligence. And that's a whole thing that maybe I'll get into later on a big picture segment, but I'll go back to the quote now so we can get a little bit further in and see what's going on now, because it's important to know what has happened in the past and what does it mean now. So currently, I'll get to the quote. Their network includes over 5,000 members, 650 trained investigators, and organizations in 48 countries. In addition to this, MUFON was formally requested to provide monthly or quarterly statistical reports to selected departments, which reports will provide a clear insight into the scope of the UFO/UAP phenomena. And that's the end of the quote. This was, in my opinion, an interesting thing to highlight, because it shows, I think, that this dialogue is increasing between what civilians are wanting to hear and what the government is looking into. And it'll evolve over time. But another form of context, I think this is important, was highlighted by someone on Reddit on this thread, is the name of Duodanglium. And this post talked about based on the average reports to MUFON, which were about 560,000 unexplainable sightings over the 52 years. This is using their averages, or 53 years, excuse me. That means that there would be 880 unexplainable sightings per month for the past 53 years based on the reporting that they're getting from MUFON. And that's an incredible admission, it's not really an admission, but just a fact that this organization has been going on for so long, and that there are these unexplained sightings that are happening to everyday people like you and I. It's not just happening to Navy pilots who people generally regard as trustworthy. It's happening to everyone, and it's a shame, I think, in my personal opinion, that we don't give more value to the average person's sighting. I'll give an interesting anecdote from my personal life, that even the person who cut my hair last, I was talking to them, and somehow I think she may have had a tattoo in a saucer shape, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. She apparently had a type of abduction experience where she lost 20 minutes of her time driving with her parents in a car, and she had never told anyone. She's like, oh, you're the first person that I've really mentioned this to. And that really changed my perspective on this, and one of the reasons that I was motivated to do this, because there are so many there are conversations that haven't been had, and it's such a personal thing for so many people, but it's stigmatized. And so I really wanted to highlight that in this week's kind of news, because it does happen all over the world. This is a worldwide organization, and why it happens is still a mystery. At least in terms of the public's eyes, we don't have any great answers. And moving on to another interesting anecdote that still talks about the new AARO, the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, is coming from this guy Robert Salas, who, I'll have to give a little more context here as well, but the quote comes from his Twitter account. So, recently I have been contacted to give testimony to AARO on the 1967 Malmstrom Air Force Base UFO incidents. Also have helped provide names of other UFO-nukes witnesses for AARO testimony. I anticipate these will be given in early 2023. Please retweet. I thought that was pretty crazy to hear. They're already working on testimony and really pushing this process forward from someone who has the credibility to really back up these sightings that were brought up in the 2020, God, I want to say it was 2021 hearings, the public hearings on UAP. These hearings, not a lot of people know about it, but it was a small hearing, relatively, to kind of provide an update to Congress about what the intelligence community knew about UAP. And the Malmstrom incident was brought up, I believe, by Congressman Gallagher. He the same guy who brought up the infamous Wilson Davis documents, which I will absolutely love to talk about at some point. These are some of my favorite documents. Very controversial, but I tend to think where there's smoke, there's fire. But anyway, let's get just more grounded on what's going on. Is that there's real testimony that's going to be given to AARO in the next, few months, and probably from more people than we expect. Perhaps other famous names in the community that will hopefully move this dialogue forward and maybe really get at the holy grail of what most people are kind of guess when they think about what the government knows about UFOs. A lot of people, if you ask them, they'll be like, yeah, the government knows a lot that they probably don't tell us. They definitely know something, and then maybe they'll be like, well, Roswell, they probably had a crash or something like that. And it's interesting because people are kind of, I would say a fair amount of people are on that mindset where the government definitely knows. But the reality of that situation is so different from just the idea of it. And that really, when people talk about being like committed to action, like Jeremy Corbell, he, much to some people's distaste, personally, I think it's interesting when your curiosity is weaponized. I'll say it again. I think it's an interesting way to describe that, where you come to contact with the level of information that is enough personally to validate, well, hey, there's something to this, and that eventually prompts you to investigate in your own way. So I know it can be funny to say, but I think it's interesting, and so I'm hoping that this kind of information will get people to go, wow, well, this guy Robert Salas, he's talking to government right now about the fact that a UFO might have shut down all these nukes. How did that happen? What's up with that? Let's go find out more. And what will come out of that, I think, is really interesting. So I'll then move on to another thing. There's an amazing amount of stuff that's going on right now. More so than there has been in the last couple years, in the last few years since I really started getting into this subject. So I'll give a quick update on the NASA UAP investigation. This came from a Defense Scoop article. It said, Defense Department and Federal Aviation Administration officials participated in a 2-day summit hosted by NASA last week, during which they met with outside experts to pinpoint government and commercial sources for capturing unidentified anomalous phenomena data. The new UAP term is unidentified anomalous phenomena, as opposed to aerial. And I'll continue the quote, Defense Scoop has confirmed. But the agencies are currently being tight-lipped about exactly who from the Pentagon attended. In October, a team of 16 executives and experts commissioned by NASA launched a 9-month independent study to explore how different types of data from public and private sensors and other means can be collected and reviewed to make sense of seemingly unexplainable UAP-type happenings that could threaten national security, and hopefully reveal new insights about the object's origins. When their study concludes, that team will release a report to the public and recommend a new roadmap for potential future NASA-led UAP data analyses. Facts are being gathered through a series of meetings, including the summit held by NASA last Thursday and Friday, that will ultimately inform future government UAP investigations. One thing, this is the end of the quote. One thing that I wanted to get into, because as I said early on, context is everything, is that this is not the first time that NASA wanted to study UAP. I mean, this is, in recent times, this is one of the very few times that NASA has openly done something like this. But I wanted to talk about another time that I heard about through Richard Dolan's book called The Cover-Up Exposed, where under President Carter, science advisor Frank Press had asked NASA to basically become the next Project Blue Book. I guess you could consider Project Blue Book almost like what's going on now, but more of a public relations deal, where they would get a ton of requests. The background is they were getting an overwhelming amount of UFO mail that was coming into the Congressional Liaison Office, and I think it was something like over 9,000 letters, and they wanted to do something about it. And ultimately, NASA, I think it didn't pan out. NASA ended up not doing it, I think partially because of the stigma. And I'll read this quick quote because it's the last thing of the kind of news that I wanted to get into, but it also will help transition to the kind of big picture ideas that I want to talk about. And so this is coming from chapter 3 of The Cover-Up Exposed by Richard Dolan. Quote, "By the fall of 1977, matters were fast approaching a climax and resolution. On September 14th, Frank Press of the White House once again asked NASA Administrator Robert Frosch to help with the UFO mail problem. This was unwelcome enough, but Press then compounded his UFO paw by repeating his suggestion from July that maybe the time was right for another study of the UFO issue." Brief pause in the quote here. When he says another study of the UFO issue, he's referring to something called the Condon Report, which ultimately was the nail in the coffin against the Project Blue Book that I was discussing earlier. I won't get into it now, but if you want to look it up, it's CONDON, Condon Report, and I'll get back to the quote. "Perhaps a panel of prominent scientists might quote within quote, conduct an investigation of the validity and significance of UFO reports. Frosch's shudders were enough to keep NASA out of this, but the CIA and Air Force had also been advising NASA to steer clear. 2 weeks earlier, on September 1st, Colonel Charles Senn, chief of the U.S. Air Force Community Relations Division, wrote to Lieutenant General Deward Crowe of NASA, quote within quote, "I sincerely hope that you are successful in preventing a reopening of UFO investigations." Everyone knew that this had been a 20-year public relations headache for the Air Force. NASA's hierarchy essentially agreed with the Condon Committee report. So that was a long quote, kind of heady. Once again, lots of acronyms, lots of names, and I understand it can be hard to just auditorily process that. But to wrap it up, basically, that report, when Project Blue Book came to a close, the Condon report had been summarizing all of the findings, and the conclusion, although many people argued that it didn't actually represent the actual work done by scientists, but the summary of the report, which was a really long report, essentially said that this was not worth studying. There wasn't enough merit to the UFO phenomena. And so this historical quote, or a historical kind of happening from 1977, shows that this controversial conclusion from the report ultimately fed into the narrative that continued to go on and influenced NASA to stay out of this problem, or stay out of the UFO kind of arena. And interestingly, today we are seeing a reversal of this pattern for reasons that I find interesting, because there's data now that continues to press NASA and other relevant agencies in the military and government that kind of show, hey, well, there's been this mismatch of what the public's been seeing, of what even the military has been seeing, what Congress or other officials might be aware of, and the narrative doesn't seem to add up. So I'm not coming out to say there's a cover-up. I think there are a lot of interesting historical things to look at, but ultimately the decision of whether you feel like there has been a cover-up comes from what you've learned about what is known and what has been said, and then you personally can kind of come to your own conclusions. So that's why I thought it was interesting to come up with this background to see, well, the narrative's changing, and we all know that narratives change over time. I'll just go right into the big picture stuff. I think this is the UFO subject, or I guess UAP. I still love the term UFO. It just carries weight to it that UAP doesn't. Most people don't. Their eyes will gloss over. They won't know what you're talking about if you say UAP. And maybe some people they're not really into it. But what I was saying is that this is, in my opinion, a dark horse situation where we've been on the sidelines hearing about all this stuff for so long. We have these crazy, movies. We had Nope that came out recently. You go back to Close Encounters of the Third Kind. A lot of people love those movies, and they're great. They're great ideas. Everyone loves the idea, but they're bubbling up to the surface from something that ultimately has some grounds in reality. And it could be an uncomfortable reality for a lot of people, but it comes up for a reason. And I'll get to some of my notes. This will be one of my first notes that I got into with the big picture stuff. Are the number of people that are reporting about these recovered crash materials or just crash wreckage. It's kind of odd. And we've heard this narrative since Roswell, and now even something, you might be aware of the Roswell, New Mexico crash, but there's even an earlier one called the Trinity crash, which I think a couple people, including Jacques Vallée, and I think essentially traditionally it was Paola Harris who was really getting into the Trinity case, and then Jacques Vallée picked it up. But this goes back to 1945, and the reason I bring it up is because it's relevant now. It's even relevant today, to the point where the legislation that went through to form AARO, I think I'm just going to go with AARO. I don't want to say RO. It just AARO works. AARO, part of the investigation, the report, will go back to records of UAP, any kind of information, I think. It's very broad, but back to 1945. And 1945 is a specific year. They don't just pick these years. It was shaped by the dialogue around the evolving crash retrieval narrative. So this narrative is so critical that congressmen, important people who have staffers, millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars at stake. I mean, when you look at the history, it's hundreds of millions. But it's shaping this legislation. And so that, for me, as like just a person in society, I'm a U.S. citizen, that has weight to me. And it also blew my mind that they went through and provided whistleblower protections. Now, I'll caveat this by saying I don't think you should just trust whatever they put in the bills and say, wow, this, because they're looking into this, it's crazy. Because, sometimes they look into things and it's not true. But it's getting very specific. And the fact that they take it seriously is something also worth considering. Even if it's not true, that's also crazy. Why are we hearing about this? I think something that it might have been Brett Weinstein or something like that. I forget his name. But he said whatever outcome, any outcome in this field is incredibly groundbreaking. It was something along those lines. And I firmly agree with that. I'll get into what I was saying earlier about the whistleblower protections. It's all wrapped up in the legislation. Here's a quote. The bill's providing whistleblower protections for, quote, any activity or program by a department of agency of the federal government or a contractor of such department or agency relating to UAP, including with respect to material retrieval, material analysis, reverse engineering, research and development, detecting and tracking, developmental or operational testing, and security protections and enforcement. That's very specific. That is very specific, and it's very broad. They're trying to cast a wide net, and I think it's interesting. A big part of this kind of narrative, I think, is shaped around the Wilson Davis document, or it's sometimes the EWD notes, some people call them, or the Wilson memo. We'll talk about that later. It's its own beast. There's a lot of interesting... People have gone really in depth to it, and I don't think personally I have the ability to really cover it in a way that's too... If you're really trying to get into the weeds with it, I would recommend other people who know about this. Perhaps look at Richard Dolan, look to some of the things that Eric Davis has said himself, or Dr. Gary Nolan has said some interesting things about it. If you look into, I think Grant Cameron has done some great work. Lots of names, I apologize, but do some looking into this yourself, because this narrative is critical. There's a reason why Grant Cameron called it, I think, the UFO leak of the century or something like that. And I'll give some more weight to it by following it up with another name, Christopher Mellon, who I believe was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense. And this was, I think, under President Clinton, I want to say, or Bush. I'm sorry, I don't know all the details offhand. You can look it up, Christopher Mellon. That's Mellon. But this is a very high position. I think it might be like third in terms of the tiers of the Secretary of Defense. Like that's the head honcho who sits in the presidential cabinet to talk about defense matters. And he posted this on his website on January 12th. And I'll end with this quote as my last piece of information, because I just think it's that crazy. Quote, "Let's also not lose sight of the fact that science may benefit as well. Having participated in debriefs of numerous military aviators and radar operators, I believe this is a genuine possibility. Indeed, I've spoken with several credible people who claim the U.S. has evidence of alien technology in its possession. These are indeed exciting times." What more can I say? I think it's interesting to let that quote marinate. Christopher Mellon's been essential to this new wave of legislation, and I think we're only going to see more of this type of stuff. So stay tuned. I'll post more episodes as information comes out, probably within maybe weekly or bi-weekly. It depends. I'm a college student, so I've got a lot of things to do. This is a side thing I know most people who do this, it's a side thing, but I'm thinking maybe next time, if I go big picture, I'll talk about the Advanced Theoretical Physics Working Group, and the Loose Threads paper. You guys might be familiar with that, but could be a lot of other things. Maybe I'll touch on the Wilson Davis notes just to give more context, because once again, I want this subject to be accessible, and I think it's unfortunately become very inaccessible, just because of the way that information is difficult to come by, and there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of misinformation. So I'll do the best that I can, and I'd love to hear your guys' feedback. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Bryce Bicknell, and this has been Beyond Phenomenal.